Hey, everybody. Welcome to Valentine's Day special episode with returning guest, Dr. Gary Lewandowski Jr.
On today's episode, we talked with Gary about his new book, Stronger Than You Think: The 10 Blind Spots That Undermine Your Relationship and How to See Past Them, which is available to you anywhere that you'd pick up a book. In the episode, though, we talked about things like optimal distinctiveness and what that means in a relationship, the Michelangelo phenomenon, and how to give a CRAPO and how that'll help your relationship hold on. Friends, colleagues, and those struck by Cupid's arrow, welcome back to another episode of Rainbows. We are your hosts. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Drake.
And today we are joined by relationship research scientist, professor of psychology at Monmouth University, and author of Stronger Than You Think: The 10 Blind Spots That Undermine Your Relationship and How to See Past Them, Dr. Gary Lewandowski. Gary, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, guys. I'm really looking forward to this.
So are we.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really looking forward to having you back on. It's been just fun catching up, just seeing how you've been over the last few months, because we had you on, was it November that we had your podcast on?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. And so we talked about breakups. We talked about self-expansion and your work on that in that area. But today we're going to be talking a little bit more about how to make relationships actually stronger and not just, throw them away, right? So this is interesting. Gary, tell us what your book's all about. We're going to be talking about it all day. So, what's it about? Give us the spiel.
Well, I mean, a lot of the book came from a course that I've taught for probably the last 15 years. I teach a relationships course. And in that course, students come in and get to learn about the science of relationships. Now, students walk through the door to that classroom with a lot of preconceived notions about what relationships are and, what helps make them work and what are good signs and bad signs and all these kinds of things. And then in the class, they're really confronted with the fact that a lot of what they thought they knew was wrong. And as I explained to them, any great college course you take should really change the way you think about the world. And when possible, ideally, those changes are based on research-based information. Science guides, improvement in our ways of thinking about the world. And so that course, I hear from students all the time, how much of a difference that course has made in their lives. I hear from students years later talking about, how they're still applying the lessons that they learned in that course to their everyday life and making their relationships better or knowing which relationships to get out of. And so this is really my attempt to take that course and move it beyond the walls of my classroom and really try to, upscale it in a way so I can, bring the benefits of relationship science to a much broader audience.
That's a noble cause.
Yeah, it's like, it's odd to say, but I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. It's the idea where, you got to kind of figure out why you're doing anything. And then once you figure out your why, the what and the how really just kind of reveal themselves to you. Mm-hmm. And for me, long ago, I figured out that my why is really to use science to help make people's lives better. I grew up in a very blue collar background, from Northeast Philadelphia, born and raised, and the playground's not where I spent most of my days. But, I'm like the first in my family to even go to college. And so, I don't know, it's just part of that has always stuck with me in terms of just being practical. And, as much as basic research is interesting and really useful, I've always gravitated more towards things that are more immediately applicable to everybody's life. And so this book, is that attempt to take all of the information that we know about relationship science, or at least most of it, and make it accessible, because it's clear to me that when better decisions come from better data. And so much of that data is behind paywalls and locked away in journals and written in a way that, even bright people have a hard time understanding. And so this is, my translation of that work to a format that's engaging and accessible and hopefully just really, really helpful to people in their lives.
It's brilliant. Gary, You're literally describing why we started the podcast. And I love that you share the same ambition and same goals as us. I think that's awesome. That's why we have you on, because we love your work and we love the stuff that you're doing. So let's get into it. I love this topic. I actually started doing research for that exact reason. I took an interpersonal relationship class and it grabbed me. And I was so interested in why people are so, why people can be so good in relationships and why relationships can be so problematic. And I was trying to kind of piece that together with my personal life and with my academic life and trying to figure out, how can I study this? So you are looking at these 10 blind spots. And I love the title of Stronger Than You Think, because often when people are thinking about their relationships and how to improve it, it's easy to look at, your relationship's struggling or what the issues are, and not actually focusing on how to improve it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, our relationships, we can't forget the basic fact, like our relationships are really, really important to us. We cherish our relationships. I mean, they're so much a part of who we are that we're protective of them, you know, as we should be. And yet, you know, we know from, you know, all the work by Kahneman and others that, you know, loss aversion is a real thing. Like we're worried about losing things that we care about. And so a lot of times we do have this negativity bias where we look for the bad things. And if you look for those things, you're going to find them. But the other side is that if you look for the good, you're going to find that as well. And really, this book is an attempt to kind of help people, you know, look for those good things, the things that they're taking for granted, the things that they aren't appreciating. And a lot of it's based on just some flawed assumptions that they might have. And that's where the blind spots come in. There's a lot of things that people think are correct and think that are helping their relationship that actually are undermining it and making it worse. And, you know, it's just a chance to really focus on what's right instead of focus on what's wrong. And it really comes from my own personal experience. It's something that I realized as a grad student. You know, it's much like you just said. It's you start learning about relationships. I don't know what your experience was, but you know, as I was learning about them, I started falling into this medical student syndrome almost, where right, it's like you start hearing about like all these, you know, signs of what's wrong. You're like, oh my gosh, I have that. And you hear about this other thing, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have that too.
Yeah.
And you can start really obsessing about all these problems. But then, you know, also during grad school, I discovered positive psychology. And there's something about the idea of focusing on the strengths, focusing on what's working, focusing on, you know, what nourishes relationships and helps them flourish and helps them grow. And I think that is just such a better way to look at the world, because that way, if you're wrong, you're not wrong twice. Right? Like if you look for bad, right? You're like, you feel bad about looking for bad things, and then you find it and it's like, crap, you know, now you get to feel bad twice. But if you look for good, you know, hopefully you find good and then everything's great. But, you know, if you look for good and then you find bad, then you only have to experience the bad side of it once.
Yeah.
So, you know, this book is really an attempt to help people break out of that mindset of, you know, this is what's wrong and this is what's wrong. And it's really why a lot of people, I think, don't want to pick up self-help kinds of books. Because, you know, if you have a relationship and you love your partner and everything's going great, like, why would you want to pick up a relationship book? Because you might find out something that's wrong.
Yeah.
So this this approaches it from the exact opposite angle, which is, you know, your relationship's going really, really well. So let's find some other ways it's going well that maybe you haven't appreciated. This is going to just make you feel better.
Yeah. Why not strengthen those weak points?
Exactly. And, you know, it's like the cover of the book has a knot that's shaped in a heart, obviously for lovey reasons. But, you know, the reason that image is on there is because of the famous quote by FDR. It said, you know, when you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. And so part of that is the idea that in a relationship, if things are going badly, rather than just let go of the rope and, you know, jump into some other relationship or quit or get divorced or break up, you know, tie a knot and hang on, right? Because there's a lot of things there in your relationship that you can, you know, quote unquote, tie a knot with that make it worth staying. And it might be things you never thought of or haven't been seeing all this time. The other thing is, if, you know, your relationship's already going well and you already have a bunch of knots in your rope, a few more aren't going to hurt. Right, it's only going to help you, you know, hang on even better.
Yeah,
Yeah,
through more difficult times for sure.
Yeah,
I think one thing that I kind of want to just open up with is like when someone asks me about my partner, like, you know, I feel like everybody kind of gets this where they'll either talk to their parents or friends and say, you know, how are things going with the relationship? What kind of responses do you expect as a researcher after writing this book? What do you think is a healthy response to that? And what do you think is an honest response?
You know, an honest, that's a good question. You know, I think an honest response would be there's some good things and there's some bad things, and we're working on the bad things to make them better. Right. And also, you know, I pause there for a second because I think the honest response should be the healthy response. Right? Yes. I mean, that is a very, very healthy response. What I think people actually say is they reflexively say, oh, we're happy, we're great. But then in the back of their mind, they're not so sure. Right? Because it's really actually quite difficult to know how well your relationship's going. You're a sample of one. Your relationship experience is limited. Though you know it well, it is still limited. And we know that experience isn't the same thing as expertise. And so, you know, to really know how your relationship is going, a lot of times you just compare it to some previous relationships. Those previous relationships have ended likely because they weren't that great. And so you're kind of using an awkward comparison group to determine the health of your current relationship. in a way that can make you feel better about it than maybe you should, or worse about it than you should. And the fact is, you just don't know. It's really hard.
That's
Well,
such a good point. Yeah. Sorry.
yeah, and I think you kind of mentioned like the 10 blind spots, and I think that maybe that's exactly what you're getting at here, right? Is like, how do you compare something where, in one area, in one of these 10 blind spots, or the many others that I imagine exist, something didn't work, and as a consequence, that relationship ended. But it's not like all of them are bad, right? Like, I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say here, and I can't articulate it.
Yeah,
Uh, just keep
I have
going.
the same thought though, Kyle. It's
Yeah.
interesting, and I've had this thought recent, like in all my relationships. It's kind of funny because the metrics that we're using, as you said, is our previous relationships with our exes, and they could be good, they could be bad, just like you said, Kyle. But like we are making that comparison to what our goals are, our future is based on relationships that didn't work, and so we're trying to kind of piece together what makes this relationship better or worth staying in.
Yeah, we also, one of the other things we use as a point of comparison is what we see on social media.
True.
Which, we intellectually know that what we see on social media is a greatest hits reel, right? I mean, it's a carefully curated type of, self-presentation that people are putting on there to cultivate a certain perspective on their relationship. But we still see that and we think like, oh my gosh, they must have this great, great relationship. And so if you're not having these super exciting looking date nights and, painting parties and whatever it is that people are doing together, you can start feeling really bad about your relationship really easily.
Yeah,
without realizing, and the crazy thing is the research shows that couples that post more about their relationship on Facebook and things like that are actually less secure in their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right?
nobody's posting, like, everybody's curating what they're posting. Nobody's posting, yeah, we stayed up until 2 a.m. fighting, right? Like,
Sure.
like, just nobody's going to do that. It's just not something that you do unless you're, I mean, maybe somebody does, but that would be weird in and of itself, I suppose.
Right, but then you scroll through all of those greatest hits of all these other couples' relationships, and you start, the base rate of how good things are at all times starts to mess with you a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You start thinking like, wait, we're not super happy at all times, and so there's a problem. We disagreed about something the other day, and so that's a problem because no one else is doing that, and you're just wrong.
Right.
It's this myth of perfection. It's something I call, it's one of the myths in the book that I call the perfection trap. It's one we don't realize that it's particularly in America, we're much more romantic about relationships than most of the world, right? Like we believe in love at first sight, and we believe that love is going to be perfect, and so we fall into this trap and we almost feel like self-righteous and like noble about it. Like no, I only expect the best. Like I demand that my partner be absolutely perfect in every possible way. And what we call this in the research is you're a maximizer. You're someone who, demands only the best. And, maybe that's okay, when you're thinking about, getting the best iPhone. But when it comes to people, that's really hard to accomplish because it also sets you up for this mindset where, if I only demand the best and while I think you're the best, I'm going to stick around. But as soon as I think there's something better, I'm going to move on. Right. And that's really not how we expect relationships to go. We expect more of a until death do us part and not until someone else comes along who's better, right, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's this myth of maximization that, I'm constantly going to try to have this best thing that I can possibly have. But what we see is that people that approach life that way are actually, less happy. They're less optimistic. They have lower self-esteem, less life satisfaction. They're just not doing as well.
Yeah, that's tough. I'd kind of imagine it sort of like, somebody can't score 10 out of 10 on every possible category, right? Like
Sure.
every important category for you in a relationship. And so part of it, I suppose, is kind of learning, okay, what scores am I willing to take sevens on? You know what I mean?
Right.
And
Yeah.
where do I expect those tens and where do they need to be? And to me, that maybe is speaking to kind of the difference between North American views on relationships and views elsewhere in the world. Is that a fair characterization?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in other parts of the world, they take more of this golden mean perspective where, you don't, it's about happiness and moderation. And so it's exactly like you described. Like everything doesn't have to be a 10 out of 10. Some 7 out of 10s are acceptable because, moderation is okay. Like you don't have to be the best in every single thing. And it's frankly just more realistic and less presumptive, right? Who are you to expect perfection out of other people? When part of you knows you're not perfect, or you should know that, right? Right? Like you should realize that. Like, really, like, are you perfect tens on everything? You're not. Like, you might be really smart, but you could be moody and a little bit prickly, right? I mean, you have certain things that aren't perfect. And so who are you to expect perfection when you yourself are not, rising to that same threshold?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gary, I have a question about that.
Sure.
There's a really cool. I'm thinking of deal breakers. That's
Mhm.
essentially what we're kind of getting at here, right? Like, what are your deal breakers in a relationship, and how do people compromise? How do they know when to compromise on certain things and say, oh, okay, that's something I don't like about this person, or I don't necessarily vibe with, but there's all these other things that are good, so I'll stay within that relationship. How do people decide those deal breakers, and what are the main deal breakers that people have?
What people should do is not necessarily what they do. What
Yeah.
they should do is really spend some time thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't. We all think we know ourselves better than we really do. And as much as you think you know yourself and spend a lot of time thinking about yourself, you just don't. And there's lots of studies that show we just don't spend a lot of time thinking about ourselves. And in fact, we'd rather shock ourselves with electric than spend some time thinking about ourselves. So the prospects for how much we think about our relationship aren't much greater, and so people don't spend as much time thinking about these things as they should.
Mm.
That said, even when people do make predictions about what they think they want in a relationship and what things are important to them, the research shows when people are actually put to the test, they don't really follow any of those things. We're kind of bad at predicting our behavior in this way. But I think that all just goes back to people just not knowing themselves that well and not actually thinking about it that much.
Right.
I always say to the students in my class, like, a lot of these findings apply to people who have never had a class on relationships and never have spent time thinking about this in this objective scientific way. And so if you spend more time thinking about it in this way, it should help prevent a lot of these problems.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so you talk about deal breakers, like one of the big deal breakers is, a partner who's too needy. And so, that speaks directly to one of the other myths, which is, people think that for a relationship to be successful, you and your partner need to be super close. You don't, right? I mean, you need to be close, right? You need to have that an emotional connection with them, but it's not that the relationships that spend every waking moment together and completely have merged their identities is actually the best way to approach a relationship. In many ways, it's a bad way to approach a relationship.
Right. Yeah, you don't want to completely suck out all the uniqueness within each individual in the relationship, right?
Yeah, you need we talk about it in other contexts, but this idea of optimal distinctiveness, right? I need to have some parts of me that are just me, and then, part of me can go into the we.
Mm-hmm.
But, you need to also have part of you that's separate from me. And so, we need to have this, nice balance. It's a push and pull of blending our identities, but also remaining our own individual selves.
Yeah, you have to know the difference between you, me, and we.
And a lot of relationship success is about taking the me and blending it into a we.
Yeah.
But you don't want to do it where you completely lose everything about who you were before. That's not healthy either.
Yeah, because as soon as I mean, I feel like I've seen that in people in relationships as well. You can see people that kind of like just take the form of whoever they're with, and kind of like assume a new identity based on whoever the person they're dating's, whatever their personality is.
Right. Yeah. It's like they're a liquid and they're pouring themselves into whatever, shaped vessel their partner is, and they just take on that exact shape.
Mm-hmm. And that's not going to give you that long-term, the longevity of a relationship where you're really giving both, that relationship perspective and your individual, like, personalized perspective into that, partnership.
Right. Because, you need more equality in relationships. Both, the best relationships are where, a blending of equals who both have independence and have shared power and decision making and all those types of things. And so, fully, changing yourself to be more like your partner is really not the way to go. Too much of a shift in the balance of power, I think.
Mm-hmm. On that kind of perspective, Gary, what are your thoughts on? I've heard varying degrees of people's perspective on this. What are your thoughts on changing somebody that you're with? Trying to change them. What does that bring up in your head? I'm sure it's not great.
Specifically, it brings up chapter 6.
Okay, there you go.
But so there's actually a whole chapter devoted to this, because I think it is like one of the most common things that people struggle with.
Awesome.
Because we know that relationships change people's sense of self. I've done a lot of relationship research myself on this, about how who you are gets shifted by your relationships, for good and for bad. But we start thinking like, oh, if relationships change us, then we should help our partner change who they are. bad idea, because we know that, personality is largely pretty stable. And when people start changing their personality, it makes them less happy, less satisfied with life. We also know that what you think is good for them may not actually be good for them. And the ways you go about trying to change your partner generally aren't well done or well executed.
Okay.
So, it's like, oh, I'm going to make my boyfriend be a better communicator, and I'm going to do it by constantly nagging and harassing him, and making him feel guilty about not communicating enough. And no, 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 no. That's not how that's going to go.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, that's just going to create, more of a drive for distance. And, it's really, you can see the flaw in this way of thinking if you just shift perspective, right? What if your partner decided that you were only going to be a good partner and fully worthy of being loved if you changed X, Y, and Z about who you are?
Mm.
You would say, like, what the hell is that? Like, that's not okay. Right. It's a fundamentally flawed idea that, we're going to be there to change our partner and that we know what's best for them. It's, super presumptive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Super problematic. I think how do you go about to do it in a way that's, the way that I see it is like, it's great to be and talking about your self-expand. I mean, thinking about your last episode that we had you on for where we talked about self-expansion. I mean, I'm always thinking about how to improve myself, and I want to kind of have a partner that does that as well. And that's what I've looked for in my partner.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you endorse that whenever they're like, I know I want to change on these things, but you can't be pushing me to do it,
Yeah, no, it's actually the perfect question, right? And the fact that, like you just described, if you're someone who is a self-described expander, you should look for someone who's also an expander, because the research shows when you match styles with somebody else, it's better for your relationship. So that's really smart. And the thing is, we can't change our partner. We shouldn't seek to change or aspire to be the change agent for our partner, but our partner is going to want to change, and they want relationship support, right? I mean, that's probably why we're in relationships, to have a supportive partner. So what we really need to do is embrace something, I talk about in the book, the Michelangelo phenomenon. And it's the idea of helping to sculpt your partner. And now that sounds contradictory to what I just said about, you shouldn't be the change agent. But, if you learn a little bit about what Michelangelo thought about sculpting, it actually is quite consistent. What he thought was that you weren't there to create something. You were there to help reveal what was already there. And so, there's a quote about how, his job was to scrape away the marble to reveal the angel within. And so your job is to help your partner reveal their inner angel by letting them decide what that looks like. They get to decide who they want to be and how they want to be it. Your job is to just play the supporting role. And so, one of the examples I give in the book is, if your partner, says that they want to be more adventurous, then you help, maybe you find a paddleboarding class that they can take, or, suggest that you guys both go on a hiking trail you've never been on. Subtle things like that is supportive, where, they get the ball rolling, so to speak, and then you just help keep it going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I love that analogy. It's perfect, the Michelangelo analogy. But and my thought is that, and that what I've heard from my partner as well is that, I don't. Let me rephrase this.
Careful.
Yeah, this is thin ice here.
I don't want to miss my partner and be like, "What the fuck are you talking about?"
Yep. Careful.
Yeah, I'm just gonna leave that out. Wait, we're gonna cut that. So I mean,
alarm bells are going off inside my head. I'm like, oh god,
be careful here, man. You need to be real careful. One thing that I think is like a really important sentiment, and that I really like about that as well, is that, you're not in love, or you're not with the person for who they could be. It's who they are at this moment, and then you're along for the ride, more or less.
Yeah, and that's because that's exactly what you want from them, right? I mean, there's that kind of implied reciprocity where we are who we are. I love you because of who you are. You love me for who I am. Not, and a lot of it is we get into these long-term relationships because dating can be exhausting. We're always trying to put on the best version of ourselves. And in our relationships, we're with those people because we know we can be our authentic selves. And so, if you start to dislike who I authentically am and want to change it, even if it's for the better, it feels unsupportive. It feels like you're not accepting me for who I am. And we know that people like to be with relationship partners, friends, roommates, other people that see them as they see themselves. And so if I start to suspect that you don't see me the same way I see myself, it starts to create distance.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think one prime example of this is like working out. Whenever you get that freshman 15 or the new relationship 20 or whatever it is, or Kyle, is it going to be 30, like firstborn 30?
Yeah. Yeah, probably.
Yep.
Kyle's got a newborn on the way. I'm just teasing.
Good luck with that.
Thank
Yeah,
you. Yeah. I'll ask you later if you've got any tips.
yeah. But I mean, with that, I mean, it's obviously if you see yourself as, you're not happy with your body and your partner's like, yeah, I mean, like I've seen you more fit, but I want to be supportive. I feel like that one is often fraught with error on especially male sides, trying to be supportive, but also coming across as being quite rude.
Yeah, there's a lot of danger there.
Yeah.
That's a tough needle to thread sometimes. But I think the best way to handle that is, I think you're great the way you are, but I'm happy to support whatever it is you want to do,
Absolutely.
without getting into specifics about goal weights and activities and things like that. And then in practice, follow through with some authentic support. Like if they need time to work out and you can free up some time by doing the dishes or doing more things around the house or watching the kids or spending more time at work, whatever it happens to be, look for ways to offer that support. And ideally, that support that you're giving is support that they don't necessarily explicitly notice.
Mm-hmm.
It's something I talk about it in chapter 10, invisible support. We often want our partners to be supportive and we get really upset when we don't see them supporting us. But the best support in relationships is actually the support you don't see. When we get too much support from our partners that we see, it can actually start making us feel worse about ourselves.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk a little bit more about support because this is the work that I do as well, Gary. And I love that you brought up invisible support. Let's talk a little bit about, what support can help in these situations and what support can be damaging, even though it's well-intentioned, right? I find that invisible support is a really cool line of work. And men, I think in general, we tend to give less emotional support and more informational and instrumental support. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah. And I'm not gonna take the fire away from you, Gary. You have the book. You have all this work in this book, so I want you to talk about it instead of me babbling the whole time.
Well, I mean, no, you're in this particular area, you're certainly probably much more expert than I am. But I think this idea of instrumental versus emotional support. A lot of times we want to leap into a problem solving mode with our partner, and whether they want it or not.
Yeah.
But if we're trying to solve our partner's problems, especially if they don't ask for it, there's an implication there that we think they can't solve it on their own.
Yeah.
And that's where it starts to undermine feelings of self-esteem and confidence in those types of areas. And so that's why invisible support is so useful. It's I'm helping you without any hint of letting on that I think you can't do it. And a lot of times, our partners don't even, it's invisible, so they don't notice it. And so it's helping them without any risk of harming, their self-views, which is useful.
Yeah, I think that's the coolest thing. I mean, most people in support literature and, in relationship research, they think, oh yeah, support, like it can't be bad if you're supporting a partner, right? And it's there's a theory, the matching support theory, and the idea that, if you're not matching your partner's needs, then you're going to actually do damage in the end. And sorry, go ahead.
It just speaks to the global theme of the book and these blind spots is exactly what you just said. Is like so many just people assume that support good, more support better, and it's just not that simple. I mean, as much as people are ready to acknowledge that relationships are difficult and complicated, they really do a good job trying to oversimplify it in a way that is harmful. And so, all support isn't created equal, and it can actually, hurt our partner's self-esteem, increase their anxiety, make them more depressed and angry. It feels condescending in some contexts. And so, the other difficult part about invisible support is you have to acknowledge that it's invisible and should stay invisible.
Yeah.
Right. In the sense that, you can't sort of run all these supportive behaviors in the background, right? Aspiring for it to be invisible support and then get ticked off when your partner doesn't notice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because your partner, chances are, is not going to notice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And it's something I talk about too, is that, sacrifice, we know that, part of being in a relationship is sacrificing for our partner. And the good news is that when we sacrifice for our partner, it increases commitment. The bad news is it doesn't necessarily increase satisfaction or happiness. It also doesn't always increase commitment in our partner. Um, when it does work, it only works, according to one study at least, on days when you're not stressed out and not, experiencing a bunch of hassles.
Mm.
I don't know about you guys, but I don't experience many of those days,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's a tough ask. And so, if it's only going to be helpful in a limited way, in a limited context, and it doesn't help our partner be more committed, you have to kind of wonder what you're doing. And the reason why our partner doesn't, get the benefits of our sacrifice is 50% of the time they don't notice it, right? They don't realize all the times that you could have complained about something that you didn't, that you were in a bad mood, but you pretended that you were in a good mood, right? I mean, there's a bunch of things that they're just not going to be privy to.
Yeah.
And so if you feel like you're making a bunch of sacrifice, doing a bunch of things for your partner, but it's not helping them and it's not helping you, and worse, you feel like they don't notice, I mean, you're setting up a pretty toxic combination to really undermine your relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you're trying to make that, those things, your partner's life easier by doing invisible support, like, doing the dishes or doing tasks that they'll have to do, but it'll reduce their stress. Like, that's great. But once you start asking for that recognition, it becomes much different. And not as supportive.
Right. You end up in those fights like, well, you could have thanked me for doing the dishes. Well, I never asked you to do the dishes.
Yeah.
In fact, I didn't, and it's like, wow, now this thing that really could have been a net positive starts to be like, oh, why should I ever bother?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, it's a minefield that, it started off so good and then it just can end up so bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with that invisible support, it's like, you do it and you don't ask for that recognition, and you hope that your partner does it and doesn't ask for that recognition. But once, I can envision those fights where they're like, yeah, I did the dishes like all week and you never said anything. It's like, well, it was because you were doing it to support me invisibly, but now you're making it visible.
Yeah, and we know that, when people are engaged in supportive behaviors or sacrifice behaviors, if they're doing it for the good of the relationship, it's a net positive. But if they think they're doing it because they're obligated and it's like, oh, I have to do this because this is part of my job, it's not helpful,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it again just kind of speaks to this idea is that, is sacrifice for your relationship good? Well, generally. Is support for your relationship good? Well, generally.
Yeah.
But there's myths and blind spots that we have associated with these concepts where if we don't apply it quite the correct way, like I've been saying, you can just do a lot more harm than good.
Yeah. Hey Gary, here's sort of a question for you, and then I actually want to move on because I've got two questions that I think are important that I'd really love to get to, but I want to get your thoughts on this. So I'm busy working on my comprehensive exam, which is a big exam that graduate students have to write, and in some ways it's performative, but you've got to get it done, right? And so I've been super busy, and my wife's been really busy with work, and so one of the ways that we are trying to support each other, and I think maybe in some sense, now that I've listened to this, maybe this is a form of invisible support that we've kind of foisted upon each other. But one thing that we're doing is we started reaching out to family members, ask, my family and her family have offered to make meals for us, and so that's something where suddenly we're like, yeah, okay, we'll take that. That's something that we'll gladly accept at this particular moment. But the other thing that we're doing is we've gotten into it's called fresh prep, and I'm sure there's an equivalent where you are, but they deliver all the ingredients that you need to make a meal. And so part of what we're trying to do is shift some of that work away from going to the grocery store and planning the meal and all that, and having more time where it's just us, where we're getting to try something new in the kitchen, make something that we haven't made before. Can that be a form of invisible support, or is that a different kind of support that I'm not aware of?
I'm not so sure it would count as invisible just because you're doing it in such a planful, mindful way, and you see it happening. I think it's super smart. I think anytime you can offload tasks that give you more time to focus on what's really important, like your relationship, you're doing a smart thing, right? I mean, time is the one non-renewable resource, right? And so time is immensely beneficial. And the part that I really liked in hearing what you just described is your meal making together. Right? Like this idea of, you kept saying it was like new and different. And, we know, we talked about this last time with self-expansion stuff. It's just, you and your partner together doing things that are new and different. I'm sure some of these meal preps aren't the easiest thing. So it's a little bit challenging too, but you're working through it together and kind of problem solving along the way is really fantastic. And so, in some ways, because you're helping your relationship maybe in an unanticipated way, there's some aspects of an invisible support there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No,
I,
I just wanted to kind of get your insight on that. I think it's one thing that I'll just quickly add this an anecdote about myself is that I know that I don't share well in the kitchen, and so when I'm cooking, I need to cook. Like I find it very challenging to have other people in my space,
Mhm.
and so that's part of it for me as well. It's like, okay, let's try something new together. Let's do something different together, and let's do it in a way that I can sort of relinquish some of my own anxieties, whatever they are in the kitchen, right?
Mhm.
Well, and in that context, some of the invisible kind of support and sacrifice you're doing is not cursing your wife out and going full Gordon Ramsay on her, for getting in your personal space. And so she may not realize all those times you're stifling, the anger, but it's good for your relationship.
Oh,
Mhm.
good, good.
Yeah. And I think like with your family too, Kyle, like your family making those meals, they're providing what I would consider solicitous support, which is like they're expressing concern for you and Colleen, and they're enabling you, the recipients, to avoid unwanted tasks, which is generally considered solicitous.
Okay,
But that can also be problematic in different ways.
sure.
If it's with your partner and they're saying that's where, like Gary said, you can have those kind of self-esteem responses or self-efficacy responses where you're like, okay, well, they don't think I can handle this, so they're trying to take stuff off my chest.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a
But
good
the
point.
meal prep sounds optimal. You should make me a meal sometime.
Yeah, yeah. Once this all dies down, I'll have you over. We'll make something, whip something up together.
Yeah, Gary, on the support topic, um, as we said, men often are in literature. They've been shown to use more problem solving or instrumental support, uh, and that's not always the best option, especially if they have they're in a heterosexual relationship with a female. Often, emotional support is rated as some of the most positive response like type support you can give.
Mhm.
What can we do as men to improve our really shitty adaptability, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. Because I've laid I'm a victim of this as well. As I often try and problem solve when I shouldn't be.
I think some of it just harkens back to better communication skills.
Mm.
And I talk about in one of the chapters about this myth about arguing and we shouldn't argue, and how to better have communication with your partner. And one of the things I suggest is this idea that to really help understand your partner better, which is the nexus of emotional support, is that you have to give a CRAPO. And CRAPO is an acronym which is really focusing on some active listening techniques. Like when your partner is having trouble, rather than trying to solve the problem, you want to clarify, right? That's the C in CRAPO. Clarify to make sure you really understand what the problem is. The R is you want to reflect feelings, right? You want to show empathy, show that you're understanding some of the emotions that are coming through. And then that's, again, clearly, obviously a foundation of emotional support. You want to, be attending. That's the A. That's using your nonverbals. P is paraphrasing, kind of, showing that you're understanding what they're saying by repeating things back to them in your own words. And then the last one, the last letter in CRAPO is O, which is, ask them open-ended questions. Like give them the forum to kind of talk things out on their own versus you jumping in saying, what you should do? You should just do this. If you have an idea of what you think they might do, you can do something I call breadcrumbing and just kind of like with questions, just kind of lead them down the path perhaps.
Mm.
And maybe they take your suggestion and they end up exactly where you hope they would be. But maybe by asking them some of these questions, they can problem solve on their own.
Amazing. Crapo. I'm
Crapo.
actually going to use this in my life. That's actually really good. Active listening is it was such an interesting concept that I loved and I understood for a day and completely forgot how to use. As you can probably
Yeah,
tell.
I totally, I've carried it with me. When I was an undergrad, I thought I was going to be a clinical psychologist, and I had a counseling strategies class, and we talked a ton about Carl Rogers and unconditional positive regard and CRAPO. And I've clearly moved away from that path. But it's always something, as though it's a counseling strategy or technique. I mean, if you can just get good at what I call giving a CRAPO, you're automatically going to be a better relationship partner. Not only that, I mean, you're gonna be a better friend, you're gonna be better everything. But like, there's so few people in our lives that really actually authentically listen to us, that when you have a partner who really does give a crapo, it's a life-changing experience.
Yeah. And it takes work. Like that takes a lot of attention and work to be, engaging in that kind of, listening and responding.
Certainly, I mean, it's a skill, and it's part of it is just realizing from the jump that it's not about giving advice.
Mhm.
People don't want to give advice, have, unsolicited advice. It's the worst kind. People want to feel felt heard and felt understood. And so, as I point out in the book, um, in order to spell CRAPO, I had to make R reflect feelings, but really what the R is empathy. But what the R could stand for is really important, because that idea of mirroring back and understanding the underlying feeling that someone's expressing to you is probably the most important letter in there. Because as much as your partner's complaining about what their boss did at work and blah, whatever it happens to be, really there's an emotion there, and it could be frustration, it could be anger, it could be that your partner feels unappreciated, right, and or undermined, or there's something more to it. And if you start approaching conversations with your partner from that frame, you're going to understand them better. They're going to feel more understood, and your relationship's going to thrive because of it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Last question before we jump into the blind spots, Gary, because we've been delaying this. I mean, we can talk for hours with you. You're amazing guest to have. We love having you on.
We've hit a lot of these blind spots kind of along the way, so we're doing all right.
Yeah. I'm hoping we're getting there. I have a question about just relationships in general. Is fighting good in a relationship?
Generally speaking, yes. I mean, it depends on what kind of fight. I guess fighting is kind of the more extreme form. I always say that arguing is a good sign.
Mhm.
You'll hear couples kind of proudly proclaim, like, well,
We don't.
so and so and so, we have never had a fight.
Yeah.
And they say it with such pride, and every time I hear it, I'm like, ooh, bad. Ooh. Because, if you're in a relationship with someone who's actually your equal, and you share power, and, you're two independent adults who think for themselves, how are you not going to have arguments about things? It seems impossible to me. And it's like, the only way to not have arguments is to not voice your opinion ever. Right. And so the lack of arguments is a real problem. And what ultimately ends up happening is people who start off with this idea that arguments are bad, you can pull that off early on. Early on in a relationship, things are all going so well, there's nothing to argue about. And so you start to try to keep that streak alive, and things come up and you let them go, because we don't fight. Comes up again, we don't fight. I'm gonna just let that go. Okay, whatever. And then eventually, all of a sudden, one last thing happens, and you explode.
Mhm.
Right? It's they left some laundry on the floor and didn't put it in the laundry basket, and then you flip out, and then you start like a lawyer presenting their case. It's not just the shirt that you left on the floor. It's, wow, this just shows what an inconsiderate person you are, because you've done this and this and this and this. And it's what we call kitchen thinking. Like, you've been thinking about all these things, and then kitchen sinking is you throw the entire kitchen sink at your partner all at once, because you didn't want to fight. And so, rather than saving things up and having these major battles, what I always suggest is be willing to engage in several minor skirmishes along the way. Like, you can have these little points of friction and little bits of conflict, and those stave off those bigger blowups.
Yeah.
So in that way, arguments are certainly helpful.
Yeah. So how do you as a partner, how do you fight clean? How do you how do you do it in not a dirty way that's going to make things worse?
Yeah, what's the Geneva Convention of relational arguments, like relational fighting?
Well, I always say, like, when I give talks and things, that the first rule of Relationship Fight Club is, it's not you against your partner, it's you both against the problem, right? And so, if Relationship Fight Club, if you go into that with this idea that it's me against you, then it becomes about winning. And relationship disputes and conflict and arguments, it's not about winning, because if one person wins, it means the other person loses. And another person is someone you love, who's a part of who you are. Like, you don't want them to lose. So you have to kind of, fight the superordinate goal of, we have this problem. Like, we're having this difficult time with arranging childcare and pickups and drop-offs and things like that, rather than, you being selfish and not wanting to do it and me doing it for you. Like, what is actually the problem, and how can we both together as a team, right, work towards the solution?
I think you really missed out there, Gary. The first rule of Relationship Fight Club is that we talk about Relationship Fight Club. Come on.
True.
I think those are really interesting points. And I think, like, for me, there's so much that can be learned from your book. Obviously, I'm excited to read it, and all of the research that you're citing in it is what makes it so much more exciting to refer to our listeners, because that's what we're all about, is, you know, using empirical data to drive intention and change within people. And so I'm loving this. Do you have any Valentine's Day tips for, you know, those that either have been accused of not being romantic enough, or you know, even those that are romantic?
Yeah, I mean, I think Valentine's Day is you know, it's kind of the Super Bowl for relationship scientists, right? It's like our big day, and so we get asked about Valentine's Day a lot, and people always ask if I like Valentine's Day. And as much as I like the idea that we have a day dedicated to kind of celebrating relationships, generally speaking, I think it's kind of screwed up, right? Because the way we celebrate Valentine's Day a lot of ways is with material goods, and there's always these commercials about how kisses begin, and you know why you should go to certain people to get jewelry and all that, which I think completely misses the point. And so, to answer your question, I would say, you know, it's really not about what you buy. You know, it's not about jewelry. It's not really about flowers and chocolates and all that kind of stuff. It's a chance to kind of. I think people would be better off in relationships if they took Valentine's Day as a chance to discuss the state of their union, right? Where it's we take this day to celebrate our relationship, but also have a discussion about where this relationship is going, and you know how we can improve and how we can do better, and even more what we appreciate about each other. And that's more of a procedural thing. But you know, if you want to do something romantic, I think, you know, like a heartfelt card, something you made on your own, you know, write a poem. Those kinds of things are always well appreciated. We don't do them because they take time and it seems a little awkward. But those kinds of ways of celebrating our relationship are going to be much better than, you know, buying another heart-shaped box of chocolate.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, Gary, I've got 2 questions, and you can pass on both or neither or whatever. You can do whatever you want with them. First question, what is the most important blind spot?
The most important blind spot, I think, is how we define love. I think we focus way too much on the idea of love as passionate love, where it's about attraction and chemistry and just that spark and arousal and attraction, and not nearly enough time focusing on companionate love, which is, you know, comfortable, affectionate, trusting love for someone who we like and really enjoy spending time with.
Fantastic. Beautiful answer. My second question is, what is the most easily resolved blind spot?
I actually, I mean, it's the one we already talked about, but I think it's the resistance to arguing and the communication one. I think we need to just be more willing to engage our partner in conversation about differences and things that we're struggling with. We know that the relationships that do that are better. We know that the relationships that don't engage in those conversations are worse. And so it's just it's a willingness to have some, you know, potentially tough conversations, but it's the type of relationship work that once we do it is going to benefit our relationship for a long time.
I think that's great. I think anybody listening to this on Valentine's Day, if you're looking for a fantastic, empirically reviewed Valentine's Day gift that'll do far better for you than that box of chocolate that Gary was talking about earlier. Gary, you already said it. It's that State of the Union. Today's the day. Get in there, get in the trenches, and have that conversation that you haven't really wanted to have, right? Like, what better way to better your relationship than to do everything that we've been talking about today? And if you can sell it as something pre-planned, all the better for you.
Yeah, it can just be as simple as, you know, sitting over dinner and just, hey, you know, what's something that you really appreciate about each other? You know, what do you think is going really well in your relationship? And you just focus on all the good stuff. You don't even have to focus on things that you want to improve. You know, in some ways that's even better.
And I think, like, opening that up by saying something that you actually really do care about or you value in your partner might be better than saying, what do you value about me?
Sure.
I think about it.
Tell me how great I am. Come on.
You know, like, but it's true though. I mean, I think that's like, it's amazing advice, but I can imagine some of our viewers like naively being like, what's the most important thing about me?
Yeah, don't do that.
I'm giving it up first.
Oh, absolutely right.
Yeah. And I'm like, I'm hesitant because I'm lazy like that, where I'm like, oh, what do you care? Like, what is your opinion on this before I give mine, right? And I think that shows that you care, and that shows that, you know, you're thinking about what you value in your partner. I think that's really important.
Well, and you know, we got together with our partner way back whenever our relationship started for some really good reasons, and we're with them for even better reasons, that they're one of our favorite people in the world, right? And chances are they're our best friend. And you know, too often life gets in the way, and the competing demands for our time kind of intrude on, you know, allowing us to realize how great our partner is. And so, you know, as the whole book is about, you know, the relationships really stronger than we think, and we just need to take the time to appreciate them.
Yeah.
Gary, one last thing just before we go. I mean, we always ask this. Myth, misconception, something that we can just debunk nice and easy for us here.
Nice and easy. Oh, geez. I think the one simple one is we put way too much emphasis on sex, and you don't need to have as much sex as you think to keep your relationship going strong. In fact, the magic number for relationships in terms of how much sex you should have to benefit it is once a week.
Okay.
There you go. Asked and answered.
And so once a week on average? Does that mean we're going to have to stockpile on weekends here?
You might, it was once a week on average.
Yeah, we don't need to go into that any further. I think that's...
Well, just think though, if you're at the end of the year and you're lagging behind, you can have a real exciting couple weeks.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
We're about 5 weeks behind here. Yeah. So Gary, I mean, I love that myth, and I kind of want to talk about that because, sex it's made to be such a huge part of romantic relationships. So, what do we need to talk about, or how do we need to reframe it? And how should we treat sex as in couples?
Sex is important, right? I mean, it's a big part of what makes our romantic relationships feel romantic, right? If we're having relationships with our best friend, I mean, it's the sex part that takes it in from best friend to, best friend plus, right? And so, the fact is sex is a really enjoyable experience. And it's an easy thing to keep track of. And so that's where it starts to get tricky, right? Because we can keep track of how much sex we're having. We can count how much sex we're having. And so people become overly focused on the idea that how much sex we have is a clear indicator of how good our relationship is, when the research shows that that's anything but the case, right? People who have more sex don't have better relationships, and that's true now, and that's true when researchers track relationships over several years. It's not this clear-cut indicator that people think it is. And in fact, in relationships that are worse, they start having more sex, right? And so people tend to use sex as a way to fix relationships when it's also not that either, right? And so, maybe you guys have heard of, sex challenges. People will say, to fix our relationship, we're going to do this 7-day sex challenge where we have to have sex every single day for 7 straight days. And, for the more ambitious, there's 30-day sex challenges. But the idea is, if sex or lack thereof is a bad indicator of our relationship, if we have more sex, that's going to fix it. And so researchers have actually done research on this and brought couples in, basically essentially flipped a coin. Some people just kind of proceeded as is. The other group were assigned to this, they didn't call it this, but it's like the sex challenge condition where they're having sex on, consecutive days. And what they found was the sex challenge condition didn't help relationships. Actually, it made them worse, right? People started having lower mood after sex, and it became more of a chore and less enjoyable. And so, this idea that, the more sex you have, the better is one of the biggest myths out there. And a tough one because, like I said, it's easy to count. And so then it becomes easy to fight about.
Yeah,
for sure.
And people have varying degrees of sexual desire as well that you have to you need to consider within relationships. And probably there's a significant ebb and flow throughout the relationship.
Yeah. And, part of that throughout the relationship thing is that just over time, we become less and less interested. It's something like 3% per year. The amount of sex that we have declines so that, by the time you're 40, you're almost having half as much sex as you were when you were 25. And so, over time, it's necessarily going to go down. And so if you're emphasizing the amount of sex that you're having, you're banking on a dying industry, right? And as exciting as sex is, we habituate to everything, we adapt. And so, if that's where you're placing all the emphasis of your relationship's happiness and satisfaction on, you're destined for failure because, as exciting as sex was when you guys first got together, chances are it's less exciting 5, 10, certainly 20, 30 years later.
Yeah. I really want a Baconator from Wendy's, right? And so I think about it all the time, and then I go and get it. And then I go into this study, and they tell me, Drake, you're going to eat a fucking Baconator every day for 30 days. That Baconator ain't slapping the way it was the first time, right? It makes sense, right? When you think of it, and we talked about this a little bit, or I talked about it a little bit with Dr. Caitlin Goldsmith, making sex fun and making appointments with sex is actually like an important thing because, you want it, and it's not an indication of, it's not predicting your relationship satisfaction, but if you really want to have sex, you're probably engage your partner and you want to do it. Making it so that you have to do it every day, I can see that, not making things better.
Yeah, and it still goes back to the same thing. It's not how much, right? It's a quality versus quantity issue, right? And so Baconator, depending on your feelings about that, is, maybe not the world's highest quality food. So would you rather have 10 Baconators or one like Michelin star meal?
Right.
Right. And so, and the research shows, and it was a research study with older adults, the people who were most satisfied in their relationship were those who, quote unquote, had an expansive sexual repertoire, right? Which sounds fancy. It just means, they had more tricks up their sleeves or wherever they kept their tricks. But, they're just, it's quality. It's not, let's do this 10 times or 7 times or every day a week. It's like, when you are engaging in those physical acts with your partner, it's, do you know them well and are you doing them well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such an interesting topic because I don't really know what the vibe is anymore, because it's always been like, oh, sex is so taboo, religion's taboo, don't talk about these things with others. But I feel like sex is becoming more relevant and more talked about in popular media. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just like, I'm biased because of the work that I do.
No, I mean, maybe I'm biased too, but I would concur. I mean, I think it's just becoming more broadly acceptable.
And talking about the right things now is what's important about sex, not just talking about it.
Sure. Well, I mean, even just things like, talking about the orgasm gap and, how men are more likely to have orgasms than women, and, how that's been the case for, all of time, perhaps. But now just actually having those conversations, saying how like, wait, that's kind of messed up. Like, why is that? Like, that shouldn't be. That's not fair. Yeah. And I don't know if, I can tell you honestly, I now talk about that in my class, my relationships class, where 10 years ago I didn't. It seemed like a little bit too like edgy. But now talk about it with absolutely no, hesitation, and the students love that conversation.
Yeah. It's just so interesting, because I think that, I mean, as I'm thinking of younger relationships as well, where sex is like kind of like, I think of the hormones that were going through my head as a child. I'm like, man, I just didn't know what was going on. But I mean, sex is such an important thing, and people attach different meanings to sex as well, like throughout their life.
Yeah. And, I think early in a relationship, sex gets equated with love very easily because we have a lot of those, hormones kind of pulsing through our veins, and, a lot of those strong attraction feelings. And so, just because it all happens so early in a relationship, you're just always going to have more experience with that aspect of a relationship, right? I mean, it's only going to be a few relationships perhaps where you have the experience of what a relationship looks like after it's, sustained for a year or 2 or 5, right? And so, you just have more immediate experience with, like, when you fall in love, you have a lot of sex. And so we just kind of assume that it always perpetuates that way, which is not a great assumption.
Yeah, absolutely not.
No.
And one more thing, old people have sex too. That's like such a common misconception that like I just hate hearing these days. But like, old people have sex. Like, you don't stop having sex just because you're older.
It's true, right? It's study I was telling you about, the sexual repertoire one. I mean, that study I think had a sample that went from 40s up into 60s. And it's like, apparently, the nursing homes are a lot like college dorms.
Yeah. Something to look forward to in old age, perhaps. All I could think about while you were talking about some of the sex stuff is innuendos that maybe I won't share on air, but I suppose at the end of the day, what you're saying is that sex can't fill all the cracks in your relationship.
There you go. Fill all the holes.
Fill all the holes.
Your words.
Gary, we know you're a busy man. You've got a number of other appointments today, so we just wanted to thank you again for joining us today. We had as much of a good time today as we have in previous chats with you.
Great, yeah, guys. I always appreciate this. It's always a pleasure to talk to you both. On hopefully you and everyone else listening has a happy Valentine's Day.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy Valentine's Day to you and everybody listening. With that said, where is somebody going to be able to pick up not only your previous book, but your brand new one?
I mean, you really can find it pretty much anywhere books are sold. But the easiest way is if you go over to my website, www.garylewandowski.com. All the links are right there. But also while you're there, if you sign up for my newsletter, which goes out about once a month and sends, just more empirical types of relationship articles and things. You also get a copy of a previous book I worked on, The Science of Relationships, which I wrote along with several of my relationship scientist colleagues.
Fantastic.
So make sure to go to GaryLewandowski.com if you want to order Stronger Than You Think, the 10 blind spots that undermine your relationship and how to see past them. Or go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble's,
Chapters,
Indigo,
Indigo,
Chapters, iBooks, whatever
wherever you
place
pick
you
a book.
read books, and and it'll be there. So make sure to check that out and leave it a review. Leave us a review. Fuck. Why not?
Why not?
While you're at it, you know, Gary's been a wonderful guest, and we really do appreciate all the amazing work that he's put into that book.
With that, we'll wrap up another episode of Brain Buzz. Thanks everybody for tuning in. You can follow Brain Buzz on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Head over to brainbuzzpod.com to get all the latest info about episodes, content, whatever it might be. And join us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BrainBuzzPod. Until next time, cheers.
Cheers.